What do you get when a beloved fairy tale, corporate desperation, and South Park's flamethrower humor collide? A total PR inferno, starring Rachel Zegler as the accidental arsonist. Disney's Snow White remake was already clinging to life support, but then South Park came stomping in like a bull in Mickey Mouse ears and absolutely torched it, with zero mercy, zero filters, and maximum carnage. And now, Rachel Zegler is left standing in the ashes, reportedly furious, as the internet roasts her harder than the dwarves got CGI'd out of existence. But to really understand this Hollywood dumpster fire, we've got to rewind, because this saga is messier than Cinderella stepsisters fighting over a Sephora sale. What happens when the most savage show on TV decides to body slam the biggest studio in the world? You get South Park versus Disney, a cultural brawl that no amount of corporate PR can clean up. And right at the center of the wreckage, Rachel Zegler, whose portrayal of Snow White wasn't just controversial. It became the meme, the mockery, and now the punchline in a full-blown roast that's got Hollywood choking on its own virtue signals. South Park didn't just mock the Snow White remake. They absolutely annihilated it with the kind of precision roast only Trey Parker and Matt Stone can deliver. We're talking scorched-earth satire that didn't just take aim at Disney's diversity strategy, but turned Rachel herself into a walking metaphor for everything fans feel is wrong with modern Hollywood. It was brutal. It was hilarious. And it was exactly what audiences have been waiting for, anyone to say what everyone else was too afraid to admit. That maybe, just maybe, not every fairy tale needs a bold modern twist, if it means stripping the soul out of the story. While Rachel was still doing awkward damage control from the countless viral interviews where she dismissed the original Snow White as outdated and creepy, South Park came in swinging. No mercy, no filters, just a flamethrower of comedy that blew right past subtlety and went straight into we're not here to make friends territory. And the fallout? Oh, it's delicious. Insiders are already whispering that Rachel's fuming behind the scenes. She expected applause, maybe even award season buzz, for her empowered take on the Disney classic. Instead, she's become the poster child for a studio experiment gone wildly off the rails. But this isn't just about one cartoon mocking a bad movie. This is bigger. This is the moment that crystallized the cultural war between audience expectations and corporate pandering. A clash between storytelling and strategy, authenticity and algorithm. South Park didn't just roast Rachel and Disney. They exposed the deep, widening gap between what studios think we want and what we're actually willing to accept. To really understand how Disney ended up as South Park's favorite punching bag, you have to rewind a few years, because this wasn't just a single bad decision. This was the slow-motion car crash of a studio spiraling into an identity crisis, so deep it makes your cousin's fourth rebrand on LinkedIn look stable. Once upon a time, Disney was the king of magic, the gold standard of storytelling, the studio that could do no wrong. But somewhere between their Marvel burnout, Star Wars fumbles, and a bizarre obsession with live-action remakes no one asked for, the House of Mouse stopped creating wonder and started chasing hashtags. Let's be real, Disney's recent moves haven't screamed innovation. They've screamed desperation. They've been caught in a vicious cycle of reboots and remakes, slapping a new coat of progressive paint on old classics like it's going to fool anyone. Except it's not working. Fans aren't buying it. And with every modernized update, Disney seems to drift further from the soul of what made its stories iconic in the first place. Characters are being rewritten not to serve the story, but to serve the discourse. Plotlines are being neutered for the sake of optics. Dialogue sounds less like it came from fairytale and more like it was written by a PR team trying out a trend on Twitter for the wrong reasons. And then came Snow White, the remake that should have been a surefire hit, a simple, classic story with global recognition. But Disney took one look at that legacy and said, let's blow it up. They didn't just tweak the narrative, they gutted it. No prince, no romance, no dwarves, no whimsy. Just a brave new heroine who doesn't need saving, doesn't need love, and apparently doesn't need to resemble the character she's playing at all. Casting Rachel Zegler, an actress who openly mocked the original film, rolled her eyes at its core message, and all but apologized for being in it, was the final red flag waving in the face of Disney loyalists everywhere. The second Rachel started calling the 1937 Snow White weird and the prince a stalker, fans knew this wasn't going to be a respectful update. It was going to be a sanitized, studio-branded takedown of its own legacy. Suddenly, the fairy tale wasn't about love or magic anymore. It was about pushing a message, one that audiences didn't ask for, and frankly, weren't in the mood for, especially not from a billion-dollar behemoth that's been tripping over its own IPs like a clumsy intern in a mascot suit. The Snow White situation became the symbol of everything going sideways at Disney. It wasn't just the casting or the creative choices. It was the smug confidence behind them, as if the studio believed it could spit-polish nostalgia, package it with a few viral buzzwords, and expect fans to line up with open wallets. But instead of applause, they got backlash. Loud, sustained, brutal backlash. People weren't mad that Disney was trying to be inclusive. They were mad that it felt forced, hollow, and worst of all, disingenuous. The studio wasn't celebrating diversity. It was weaponizing it as a shield from criticism. And when the criticism came, Disney flailed. There were reshoots, retractions, and rumors of executives scrambling to do damage control as the internet lit up with memes, side eyes, and fan edits that looked better than anything in the actual movie. Instead of building something new or honoring what worked, Disney Frankenstein Snow White into a lifeless husk of brand-safe empowerment, so watered down it couldn't quench the thirst of its most loyal fans, let alone attract new ones. At this point, Snow White wasn't just a bad remake. It was a warning sign, proof that Disney had lost the plot, that in its effort to be everything to everyone, it was now nothing to anyone. And that's when South Park entered the chat. Not because they're contrarian for the sake of it, but because they smelled blood in the water. They saw a studio so busy chasing social media clout that it forgot how to tell a good story. They saw Rachel Zegler, positioned as the new face of a legacy, and watched her torch it with smugness and sound bites. And they did what South Park always does when they see hypocrisy wrapped in a press release. They lit a match. But before we get to the scorched-earth comedy and the internet's favorite roast of the year, let's take a closer look at how Rachel Zegler's own comments, confidence, and catastrophes only made things worse. By the time Disney officially announced their Snow White remake, the skepticism was already brewing. But the real chaos? That didn't begin until the casting of Rachel Zegler hit the headlines, because that's when the internet lost its collective mind. Not because Zegler wasn't talented, not because she wasn't beautiful, but because Disney was rebooting one of its most iconic characters, literally named Snow White for her skin as white as snow, with an actress whose look and identity clashed so hard with the source material, it felt less like a casting decision and more like a PR stunt. And that's when the backlash began to snowball. People weren't just raising eyebrows. They were asking questions. Questions like, is this still Snow White? Or is it just a corporate PowerPoint dressed up like a fairy tale? Was this really about creative vision? Or was Disney ticking a diversity box in the loudest, most obvious way possible? And if they were going to rewrite every part of the original anyway, why call it Snow White at all? But what could have been a moment of thoughtful discussion turned into an all-out internet inferno the second Rachel Zegler opened her mouth. Because instead of trying to calm the storm, she poured gasoline on it. In interview after interview, Zegler didn't just distance herself from the original film. She straight up dragged it. She called the 1937 classic weird, mocked the storyline, and even described the prince as a stalker. That's right. The prince who literally wakes the heroine from a cursed coma was now being reframed as some kind of fairy tale predator. You could practically hear Walt Disney rolling in his cryogenic chamber. And it didn't stop there. Zegler made it clear that her version of Snow White wasn't here for love or romance or anything resembling what made the original beloved. She's not going to be saved by the prince, she declared in one interview, almost proudly. She's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be. And just like that, the heart of Snow White, the fairy tale, the fantasy, the emotional core, was tossed out in favor of what sounded like a LinkedIn motivational post. Fans were stunned. Critics were confused. And the internet? Oh, the internet was furious. People weren't just mad about the casting or the rewritten story. They were mad about the attitude. Zegler didn't come off like someone honored to step into an iconic role. She came off like someone embarrassed by it. Like she thought she was above the fairy tale, above the love story, above the very thing that made Snow White matter to generations of fans. And when she famously said, "If you don't want to see the movie, don't," well, she might as well have told half the country to go screw themselves. Guess what? They listened. The fan outrage wasn't just about nostalgia. It was about feeling disrespected, like Disney was talking down to them. Like Rachel Zegler was smugly burning bridges before the movie even had a chance. And the more she talked, the worse it got. She bragged about how the prince's role was practically non-existent, teased that most of his scenes could be cut entirely, and made it clear this Snow White wasn't about finding love, but finding power. Which sounds great, unless you remember that this is a fairy tale, not a campaign ad. And then came the plot rewrites. The romantic arc was axed. The charming prince reduced to a background extra. The seven dwarfs? Swapped out for a bizarre crew of CGI adventurers that looked like they wandered off the set of a failed CW fantasy pilot. Gone was the warmth. Gone was the whimsy. Gone was the message about kindness, dreaming, and finding your own happily ever after. In its place, Disney served up what felt like a soulless corporate remix of empowerment buzzwords, completely disconnected from the story's roots. Fans didn't just disapprove, they revolted. Hashtags like hashtag #NotMySnowWhite and hashtag #FireZegler started trending. Meme pages exploded. Side-by-side comparisons of the original versus the remake flooded timelines. People weren't laughing with Disney. They were laughing at them. TikToks mocking Rachel's interviews went viral. YouTubers tore apart every leaked detail of the plot. And fan forums lit up with a single burning question. Why is Disney trying so hard to fix stories that weren't broken? The outrage reached a fever pitch when leaked set photos showed the new dwarfs, a ragtag group of actors of various ethnicities, genders, and heights, with only one actual little person in the lineup. What was meant to be a move toward inclusivity ended up alienating multiple communities at once. Critics said Disney was erasing dwarf representation in the name of sensitivity. Fans said the new characters looked like background extras from a bad Renaissance fair. It was a lose-lose across the board. And the worst part? Disney seemed totally unprepared for the blowback. They backpedaled. They reshot scenes. They CGI'd the dwarfs back in. But the damage was done. Snow White went from being a beloved property to a punchline. An example of what happens when a studio forgets the magic in pursuit of marketing. And Rachel Zegler, she became the face of that disaster. Not because she's a villain. Not because she didn't belong in the industry. But because she underestimated the story, the legacy, and the fans. She treated a crown like it was a burden, and the audience noticed. All of it, the casting drama, the interviews, the plot changes, the marketing spin, it created the perfect storm. A story so ripe with contradictions, controversy, and cultural tension that there was only one thing left to happen. Enter South Park. But before we get to that glorious, unfiltered roast, let's talk about how Rachel's media tour kept digging the hole deeper and how Disney's PR team seemed to be caught in a real-life episode of Damage Control gone wild. When South Park dropped joining the Panderverse, it wasn't just another parody. It was a pop culture ambush. A surgical strike masked in fart jokes and cartoon chaos. And at the center of it, a scathing takedown of everything Disney thought it could get away with. The shallow diversity optics, the legacy IP reboots, and yes, Rachel Zegler herself. The episode wasn't subtle. It didn't tiptoe around the drama. It slammed its foot on the gas and drove right through Hollywood's new formula. Cast diverse, rewrite familiar, drown it in preachy messaging, and expect applause. The premise was simple but brutal. Reality had splintered into a multiverse of pandering. And in every single version, classic characters were replaced with race and gender-swapped versions of themselves, all played by the same smug, preachy, over-it-all brunette actress. Sound familiar? Because South Park didn't just parody Rachel Zegler, they cloned her. In one of the most viral sequences, Cartman wakes up in a nightmare world where every show, every movie, every game, and every legacy hero has been recast as a woman who looks and talks exactly like Zegler. Sharp bob, deadpan eyes, monotone voice, and an endless stream of anti-fan rhetoric. She's not a character. She's a type. The type who doesn't care about the role, only about fixing it. The type who's always exhausted by the mere existence of nostalgia. The type who rolls her eyes at fairy tales while cashing a princess paycheck. The in-universe version of Kathleen Kennedy. Yep, they named her directly. Is shown frantically inserting this Zegler-esque character into every Disney property, convinced that as long as the casting looks progressive, the storytelling doesn't matter. That's the Panderverse, a world run by empty virtue, signaling and hollow reimaginings. And Disney, in this parody, is less an entertainment giant and more a diversity-obsessed factory that thinks representation is a shield against criticism. But it's the Cartman plotline that really drives the dagger in. In classic South Park fashion, Cartman, ever the voice of inappropriate truth, is the first to sound the alarm. He's horrified by this new universe where the characters he loves have all been rewritten into bored-looking women who lecture instead of entertain. He's not upset because they're women. He's upset because they're badly written, because they hate the thing they're in, because they treat fan love like a disease. It's brutal satire, but it works because it reflects exactly what audiences were feeling about the Snow White debacle. Nobody was upset that Snow White looked different. They were upset that she acted like she couldn't stand being Snow White in the first place. That instead of honoring the role, she seemed to mock it. And South Park captured that feeling perfectly. There's one moment in particular that made the internet erupt. Cartman watches a trailer for yet another reboot. This time a gritty Star Wars spinoff, and sighs, "Let me guess, she's a badass who doesn't need no man and hates the original fans." It's quick, it's sharp, and it's devastatingly accurate. That one line summed up everything critics have been trying to articulate about Disney's creative choices, that the message was outweighing the magic. And South Park didn't stop at Snow White. The episode skewered the whole machine. Marvel, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, The Little Mermaid, you name it. The formula was always the same. Swap out the characters, crank up the identity politics, and silence anyone who questions the result by calling them sexist or racist. It didn't matter if the story suffered. As long as the cast looked like a college brochure, the execs thought they had a hit. But Panderverse held up a mirror, and the reflection wasn't pretty. What made it sting even more? It wasn't just Cartman. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny each had moments of realizing that the stuff they loved was being rebranded and hollowed out. They didn't recognize their favorite movies anymore. They weren't laughing. They were watching monologues. Emotional arcs were being replaced with lectures. Characters didn't have flaws or charm. They had talking points. The boys weren't just upset about wokeness. They were grieving the death of imagination. And as absurd as it sounds, the episode hit a nerve not just with fans, but across Hollywood. Within hours, Twitter, sorry, X, was flooded with memes, breakdowns, reaction videos, and one-liners from the episode. YouTubers hailed it as South Park's best satire in years. Even mainstream critics had to admit, the show had captured the cultural mood with scary precision. It wasn't mean-spirited. It wasn't anti-woke. It was anti-fake, anti-performative, anti-corporate nonsense packaged as social progress. And Rachel Zegler, she didn't name-drop the episode, but the silence was deafening. Her fans tried to play defense, calling the parody misogynistic, outdated, or unfair. But it was too late. The damage was already done. Because South Park didn't invent the backlash. It simply held up a funhouse mirror and said, "This is what people see when they look at your movie." A smug, sanitized, soulless mess pretending to be revolutionary. Suddenly, all of Zegler's old interviews were being clipped and recirculated. That if you don't want to see it, don't quote. Back on the timeline. Her eye rolls. Her Prince bashing. Her "she's not dreaming of true love" soundbites. All stitched into montages alongside the Panderverse parody. TikToks layered the South Park footage over Zegler's interviews with surgical precision, and the result was brutal. This wasn't just a meme war. It was reputational carnage. And the wildest part? South Park said what millions were thinking, but were too afraid to say out loud. That maybe, just maybe, people weren't mad about diversity. They were mad about lazy writing, about contempt for audiences, about legacy characters being treated like disposable brand assets. The satire worked because it didn't come from hate. It came from disappointment. And Disney? Well, their silence said it all. No counterstatement. No clapback. Just a studio caught in the headlights of a culture that had finally stopped clapping. If South Park was the roast heard around Hollywood, then Rachel Zegler's response, or more specifically, her lack of one, became its own kind of echo, deafening in its silence, awkward in its absence, and for a moment, surreal in how uncharacteristic it was. Because Rachel Zegler, she's not shy. She's not the no-comment type. This is someone who once live-tweeted her thoughts on the SAG Awards while sitting in the audience. A Gen Z performer raised in the digital spotlight. She knows the game. She plays the game. And yet, after Panderverse aired and clips of her parody version racked up millions of views within hours, nothing. No tweets. No vague reposts. No Instagram stories. No sly quote tweets with a side-eye emoji. Just radio silence. At first, some fans chalked it up to maturity. That maybe Rachel was taking the high road, letting the episode blow over. But as days turned into weeks and the mockery only intensified, a different picture started to form. One painted by people behind the scenes. And what they were saying wasn't quite so zen. According to several sources close to the Snow White production and Zegler's management team, the actress wasn't just quiet. She was furious. One insider claimed, Rachel didn't expect to become a meme. She thought the narrative would be about the film's reimagining, not her as a person being roasted across the internet. Another added, the South Park thing hit her harder than anyone expected. She felt personally attacked, not just professionally. Behind closed doors, things were reportedly tense. Very tense. A former publicist who briefly worked with Disney on the Snow White campaign said there was serious internal debate about whether Rachel should address the parody at all. There were drafts, the source said. Multiple responses were written, some witty, some snarky, some trying to turn the moment into empowerment. But none of them passed legal. And frankly, no one could agree on whether acknowledging it would make things better or worse. That's how high the stakes had become. This wasn't just about a cartoon joke. It had mutated into a full-blown PR landmine. Because the Panderverse episode didn't just dunk on Zegler's casting. It mocked her entire approach to the role. Her interviews, her tone, her disdain for the original fairy tale, her now infamous sound bites about how Snow White wouldn't be dreaming about true love anymore. All of it bundled into a single, savage caricature. And the worst part? Audiences agreed with it. Fan forums, comment sections, and TikTok feeds lit up with sentiment that had been bubbling under the surface for months. That Rachel seemed too smug, too over it, too busy rewriting Snow White to actually like Snow White. The South Park parody didn't create that feeling. It just turned it into a punchline everyone could quote. And when Rachel did break her silence, she didn't address the episode at all. Not directly, but eagle-eyed fans noticed a subtle shift in tone. Suddenly, the posts were more filtered, fewer hot takes, more polished promo shots. When asked about the movie in recent interviews, her answers were tighter, more rehearsed, gone with the sassy off-script detours. In their place, vague lines about honoring the legacy and reinterpreting for a new generation. It felt corporate, sanitized, controlled, like someone had handed her a new script, and this time there were rules. But the damage was already done. The internet hadn't forgotten her past interviews. The clips resurfaced daily. One in particular, where she laughs about how outdated the Prince storyline is, was memed into oblivion. Paired with that monotone South Park clone version of her, the effect was damning. It didn't matter if Rachel hadn't meant to sound dismissive. The perception was set. She was now the poster girl for everything people fear Hollywood was becoming. Out of touch, self-serious, and allergic to joy. And her fans? They tried to fight back. They rallied hashtags. They posted think pieces. They argued that Rachel was being unfairly villainized for simply wanting to update a character. But every time I tried to flip the script, the internet responded with more clips, more memes, more Panderverse comparisons. It was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Then came the rumors. Several outlets began reporting that Disney execs were reevaluating the film's press strategy, that Rachel's centrality to the marketing might be dialed down. Insiders whispered that behind the scenes, there was frustration with her public image, and that some at the studio felt she had unintentionally alienated core audiences. One even claimed there were early conversations about whether a red carpet was even wise. They're worried she'll get booed, that it'll turn into a circus. That's how toxic the discourse had become. Even Disney was scared of the optics. And Rachel? She still hadn't clapped back, which, for someone who once joked about being terminally online, was telling. The girl who tweeted through every trending topic was now ghosting her own drama. The silence didn't feel like control, it felt like containment. Like someone had finally pulled the plug on the Zegler monologue before it could spiral even further. But in many ways, that silence became its own story. Because audiences didn't want a polished statement. They didn't want a PR scripted line about respecting different perspectives. They wanted authenticity, a wink, a laugh, a show of humility. They wanted Rachel to own the roast, to lean in, make a joke, and prove she could take it. Instead, they got a wall of silence. And in that void, the memes multiplied. And here's the kicker. For all the viral backlash and controversy, South Park never even named Rachel Zegler. Not once. But they didn't have to. Everyone knew. Everyone felt it. Because the satire didn't just mock a person, it mocked a pattern, a vibe, a wave of modern storytelling that audiences felt disconnected from. Zegler just happened to be the face of it when the dam finally broke. Now, with the film's release creeping closer and the press tour shrouded in uncertainty, the big question remains. Can Rachel Zegler recover? Can Disney pivot? Or has the cultural tide turned too far? Because for now, the only thing louder than the Panderverse roast is her silence. Once South Park hit the airwaves and the internet crowned Rachel Zegler its newest meme queen, it was as if a fuse had been lit deep within the halls of the Disney empire. One cartoon parody wasn't supposed to cause a studio-wide panic. But this wasn't just any cartoon, and this wasn't just any film. This was supposed to be Disney's Snow White. A billion-dollar IP. A legacy title. A feminist reimagining, ready to charm a new generation. Instead, it was turning into the studio's most public unraveling in years. The panic was immediate, and it was internal. According to multiple industry insiders, meetings were called. Executives scrambled. What had begun as quiet concern over the film's tone-deaf marketing campaign had now morphed into full-blown damage control. And the first step? Delay. Publicly, Disney blamed production complications and the actors' strike for pushing Snow White from its 2024 release into 2025. But no one was buying that. The delay came just days after Panderverse exploded on social media. Just days after audiences turned what was supposed to be a nostalgia-fueled fairy tale into a cautionary tale about what happens when IP gets turned into ideology. Behind the scenes, it was chaos. Test screenings weren't just underwhelming. They were brutal. Audiences didn't connect. Parents were confused. Kids were bored. And worst of all, people laughed in the wrong places. Reshoots were rumored. Whispers swirled that entire sequences were being retooled. That jokes were being softened. That a third act twist involving the evil queen's redemption arc had been scrapped altogether. That a brand new musical number had been added just weeks before post-production wrapped. And then there were the dwarves. Ah, yes, the dwarves. Originally removed from the film in favor of magical creatures to avoid offending modern sensibilities, the backlash was immediate when first-look photos leaked. 7 vaguely humanoid extras in mismatched cosplay tier costumes that looked like a Renaissance fair fever dream. No dopey, no grumpy, just a vague, sanitized idea of diversity with no connection to the original story. It bombed. The internet didn't hold back. The memes were relentless. One viral tweet dubbed them the Live, Laugh, Love Fellowship. And once again, South Park got the last laugh. Cartman's crack about replacing the dwarves with magical non-binary woodland influencers didn't just feel prophetic, it felt inevitable. Disney panicked again. Soon after, insiders leaked that the original dwarves were being quietly reinserted. Suddenly, casting notices for short-statured male performers reappeared. Character names like Doc and Bashful were back in production memos. And Peter Dinklage, the actor whose critique had helped catalyze the original removal, was now nowhere to be found in the discussion. The studio was clearly walking backwards, trying to undo a year's worth of modern updates, without admitting that's what they were doing. But it was too late. This wasn't just a marketing issue anymore. It was a symbolic collapse. Disney's every move began to feel reactive, flustered, defensive. The studio that once set the tone for cultural storytelling was now chasing public approval like a nervous intern. Every trailer drop, every poster release, every cast quote was scrutinized, memed, dissected. And all came back to that one word, pandering. Because once South Park gave the internet that language, the panderverse, there was no going back. The damage extended beyond Snow White. Online discourse dragged other Disney properties into the fire. Fans began retroactively dissecting the Marvels, Little Mermaid, Lightyear, and Peter Pan and Wendy, asking, were these movies reimagined out of love or out of obligation? And just as things were starting to settle, just as Disney tried to pivot the conversation back to the film's timeless heart, a new rumor surfaced. And it was nuclear. Whispers began swirling that South Park wasn't done. Multiple online scoopers with decent track records began hinting that a sequel episode was in development. Not just another jab, but a full-on continuation of the Panderverse saga, this time zeroing in on the aftermath. The studio scrambling. The box office tanking. The image of Rachel Zegler trying to explain why Snow White doesn't need a man as the audience vanishes from theaters. One unconfirmed leak claimed the working title was Panderverse. Part 2, The Flop Awakens. And even if it wasn't real, the threat of it was enough. Industry watchers began asking, what if South Park made a cottage industry out of satirizing Hollywood's identity crisis? What if this was the new cultural feedback loop? One where no amount of brand control could stop a show like South Park from swinging the axe again. For Disney, that's the nightmare scenario. Because the usual playbook, reframe, redirect, distract, wasn't working. The memes were faster. The satire was sharper. And this time, the audience wasn't on their side. Because here's the terrifying truth for the House of Mouse. Once you lose the narrative, it's almost impossible to get it back. And that's exactly what's happening now. Every move they make is seen through the lens of desperation. Every cheerful behind-the-scenes clip feels like spin. Every Rachel Zegler interview is weaponized before it finishes airing. And somewhere in Colorado, you just know Trey Parker and Matt Stone are taking notes. Waiting. Watching. The snowball has already started rolling downhill. And whether it's the reshoots, the dwarves, or the panicked silence, one thing's clear. Disney isn't steering this anymore. The internet is. And South Park. They got the sledgehammer ready, again. The Snow White debacle didn't just spark outrage. It didn't just give meme account content for a month. It revealed something much deeper. Something the entertainment industry has been too afraid to admit. The audience is tired. Tired of being preached to. Tired of movies feeling like lectures. Tired of characters that feel like checklists instead of people. Tired of watching stories that aren't being told, but managed. Zoom out, and Snow White becomes more than a PR mess. It's a case study in how Hollywood lost the plot. Literally. How the industry's obsession with representation has sometimes come at the expense of resonance. Of heart. Of entertainment. Let's be clear, inclusion matters. Diverse casting, new voices, fresh takes, all of that is valuable. Necessary even. But when it starts to feel like a quota instead of story, the magic fades. And audiences know it. Enter Disney's modern era. A string of reboots and remakes so aggressively reimagined that they stopped resembling the originals at all. Instead of telling stories that reflect modern values through character and nuance, the films began to feel like corporate apologies, like they were made to answer criticism rather than to create wonder. The Little Mermaid wasn't just a fantasy. It had to be a cultural milestone. Lightyear wasn't just a spin-off. It had to make a statement. Peter Pan and Wendy wasn't just another adventure. It had to fix the past. And Snow White, that wasn't a fairy tale anymore. It was a manifesto. By the time Rachel Zegler told the world that the prince was a creepy stalker and that her Snow White would be a girl boss who doesn't dream about love, the spell had already broken. People didn't hear a fresh perspective. They heard disdain. Disdain for the original, for tradition, for the audience that grew up loving it. That's the tipping point South Park exploited. Because while Hollywood was busy rewriting stories to fit a new mold, South Park was listening to the backlash, the fatigue, the eye rolls. They took all that frustration and alchemized it into the Panderverse. And that's where the satire cut deep. It wasn't just funny because Cartman was suddenly a woman named Erica. It was funny because it was true. The show lampooned the very mechanics of what modern Hollywood had become. Algorithms that prioritize diversity boxes over character arcs. Boardrooms that believe audiences want identity instead of personality. Executives who think that just changing the skin tone, gender, or sexuality of a legacy character makes a story progressive. South Park called it what no one else would, pandering. And in doing so, they spoke to a massive chunk of the audience. Those who have been labeled bigots or misogynists for simply wanting good storytelling. People who didn't mind change but hated when it felt performative, when it felt forced, when it felt like the studio cared more about headlines than heart. It's a sentiment that's been building for years, not just in animation or family films, but across the entire industry. Look at the superhero genre. Once unbeatable, now bloated and buckling under the weight of its own politics. Films like Eternals and the Marvels promised groundbreaking representation, but failed to connect with audiences. Not because of who was cast, but because of how little else the films had to say. Audiences didn't reject diversity. They rejected dishonesty. There's a difference between telling new stories and repainting old ones. And Hollywood, in its rush to appear evolved, has mistaken one for the other. Instead of creating new, diverse icons with original stories, they've taken legacy characters and tried to retrofit them into modern narratives, often clumsily, awkwardly, and without soul. And the worst part? The creatives often know it. Actors like Zegler become the face of corporate strategies they didn't design. Writers are given mandates. Directors are handed guidelines. The art becomes a product, and the product becomes a liability. Meanwhile, South Park, unburdened by shareholders or corporate branding, just tells the truth. Through comedy, through chaos, through a foul-mouthed kid from Colorado who asks the questions no executive wants to hear out loud. And the audience is listening. Because in a media landscape saturated with virtue, signaling, and hollow progressivism, honesty, even when it's messy, crass, or controversial, is refreshing. Satire has become the new critic. And in this era, South Park isn't just a cartoon, it's a cultural scalpel. So what does all this mean? It means Snow White isn't an isolated failure. It's a cautionary tale. It means audiences don't want less diversity. They want better writing. It means studios need to stop underestimating the intelligence of their viewers. And it means that no amount of PR spin, DI initiatives, or reimagined fairy tales will save a story if it's hollow at its core. The real magic of storytelling isn't found in surface-level representation. It's in emotional truth, in characters we believe in narratives that feel timeless because they speak to something real. Hollywood forgot that. South Park didn't. And in this battle between branding and satire, the scoreboard isn't looking good for the House of Mouse. Because once satire becomes the only place audiences feel heard, the message is clear. You've stopped telling stories, and we've stopped listening. And so here we are, the fairy tale burned to ash. Rachel Zegler, once Disney's chosen one, now scorched by a firestorm she didn't see coming. She walked into Snow White with the promise of being a modern heroine. She walked out as a lightning rod for one of the biggest culture clashes Hollywood's seen in years. Her carefully curated interviews, once meant to showcase empowerment, now circulate online as meme fuel and cautionary clips. Every eye roll, every sarcastic jab at the original Snow White, every smug soundbite about not needing a prince. It all now plays like a trailer for the Panderverse sequel. Because like it or not, Zegler became the face of something bigger than herself. A symbol of a studio out of touch, an industry in crisis, and a generation of creatives who've mistaken contempt for progress. Meanwhile, Disney? They're scrambling to reshoot, to rewrite, to claw back even an ounce of goodwill. Desperately trying to win back fans they dismissed as toxic only months earlier. They reintroduce the dwarves. They backpedal on plot points. They do quiet re-edits and PR vanishing acts. But the damage is done. This wasn't just a bad press cycle. It was a tectonic shift, a cultural gut check, the kind that leaves permanent scars on a brand that once prided itself on being untouchable. The House of Mouse isn't just faltering, it's gasping. Gasping for relevance in a world that's starting to see through the magic. In a media landscape where branding used to be everything, now authenticity is king. And Disney has never felt more corporate, more artificial, more calculated. And while all this chaos unfolds, South Park is thriving. Not just surviving, thriving. The Panderverse episode didn't just roast the players, it hijacked the conversation. It forced everyone to look in the mirror. It called out what others wouldn't. It didn't hide behind coded language or gentle satire. It went full flamethrower. And people loved it. Because here's the thing, audiences aren't stupid. They see the marketing. They feel the pandering. And when South Park said the quiet part out loud, the internet exploded. It wasn't just funny. It was cathartic. The show didn't take sides, it took shots. At everyone. At DI strategies turned marketing gimmicks. At studios like Disney using progressivism as a shield. At fans who pretend everything's fine just because their favorite character checks a box. And in doing so, South Park did what it's always done best. It became the voice of the uncomfortable truth. So now we're left with this final tableau. Rachel Zegler, locked in a PR fallout she can't spin away from. Disney, choking on its own legacy, try to remember what made it magical in the first place. And South Park, sitting back, counting views, sipping its own brand of chaos, and getting ready for round 2. Because yes, rumors are already swirling. A sequel to the Panderverse. Possibly even one that hones in on the Snow White disaster, Disney's plummeting box office, and the wider unraveling of Hollywood's formulaic virtue signaling. And if that happens, let's just say this firestorm isn't over. It's about to go nuclear. So now we leave you with this. In a world where every franchise is being rebooted, reimagined, and re-engineered to match the latest trending values. In a landscape where storytelling has taken a back seat to social signaling. In an era where corporations preach authenticity but deliver algorithms. What stories are left? Who do we trust to tell them? And more importantly, are you still buying the magic, or have you seen the curtain too clearly to believe anymore? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you stand. Because if there's one thing we've learned from this entire mess, it's this. The audience still has the final word, and they're not staying silent anymore. Mic dropped.